Today, I'm going to be telling you 3 crazy stories about hikers who narrowly escaped what should have been their certain death. Hiking is usually an incredibly safe activity, but sometimes, due to either mistakes, poor choices, or just plain bad luck, things can go very, very wrong. To start off, let's take a virtual trip to the Adirondack Mountains, where in the winter of 1989, 2 hikers tried to conquer the tallest peak in New York State. This virtual trip is totally free, but you must hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. In March of 1989, 2 men from Pennsylvania took a trip to the Adirondacks in New York State. Their ambitious plan was to summit Mount Marcy, which at 5,344 feet is the highest mountain in New York State. Now, if you're used to hearing about 10,000 plus, sometimes 14,000 foot plus peaks in the western part of the United States, don't let the lower elevation of Mount Marcy fool you. I've been up there before. I've been all over the Adirondacks. The weather there can be insane and dangerous, especially in the colder months, and it's claimed many, many lives. 25-year-old Sean Dewar and 29-year-old Ralph Vecchio set out on cross-country skis in the morning on March 4th. And right from the start, they were faced with difficult conditions. On the lower elevations of the mountains, freezing rain and sleet fell, and as they climbed higher, everything turned into snow. It didn't take long before their clothing became soaked through, which is a recipe for disaster in winter conditions like this. And with that said, you can probably imagine that this story is about to take a turn for the worst. So before we get into the scary stuff, let's keep things fun for just a few more moments while I tell you about the crazy stuff going on over at Drink Element. That's right, Drink Element is the sponsor of this video, and when I say crazy, by the way, I really mean crazy awesome, because my favorite electrolyte drink mix company has once again outdone themselves. Anytime you're sweating a lot, you need to replace your electrolytes, because if you don't, you're gonna feel fatigued, your brain is gonna get all foggy, it's just not good. One of the reasons why I love Drink Element so much is because of their unique and creative flavors that nobody else in the electrolyte game is doing. And folks, let me tell you, they just outdid themselves again by releasing the limited time only Element Chocolate Medley. This trio of flavors features chocolate mint, chocolate chai, and chocolate raspberry, and it's designed to be enjoyed hot or swirled into your favorite recipes. And speaking of recipes, they have a whole bunch of them specifically designed for the chocolate medley listed on their website. How unique is that? I absolutely love it, and it makes total sense for those of you that are out winter hiking, skiing, running in the cold, or even just shoveling your driveway. So here's what you should do. Go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, and get yourself the chocolate medley before it's too late. And by the way, when you buy through that link, you're also gonna get sent a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no additional cost. One more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go try the chocolate medley and go get your free sample pack. Thank you so much, because when you shop through that link, you're gonna be supporting the channel as well. And with that said, let's get back to the story. I'm not sure how much hiking experience Sean and Ralph had, but I do know that they had summited at least one other high peak in the Adirondacks. 6 weeks prior, they had climbed Algonquin Peak, which is the second highest mountain in New York behind Mount Marcy. I guess the conditions must have been favorable that day, or maybe they just got lucky. And I say that because when they went out to climb Mount Marcy, they made some nearly fatal decisions in regards to their gear and their clothing. Forest Ranger Bill Sussdorf was quoted saying, "If they were doing what everybody said they did, then they just broke the cardinal rule of being prepared. The two men were reportedly wearing only light winter clothing and weren't carrying any warm overnight gear. They also only carried a small amount of food. So they were obviously making some bad choices there, but despite this, the men still managed to reach the top of Mount Marcy successfully. But from here, everything started to go wrong. Though reaching the summit of a mountain might be the ultimate goal for a hike, the reality is that once you're on the summit, you're only halfway there. You still have to get all the way down, which leaves a lot of opportunity for bad things to happen. The top of the mountain was completely socked in with whiteout conditions and freezing temperatures. The two men could not locate the trail back down the mountain, and they spent about 2 hours stumbling around trying to find this trail. Eventually, they ran out of time, however, and were forced to hunker down for the night. They made a dugout in the snow and covered themselves with pine tree branches in a desperate attempt to ward off hypothermia. Sean and Ralph tried to build a fire, but everything was just so wet that nothing would ignite, not even the $20 bills that Ralph had in his wallet. They spent the night trying to stay warm by hugging each other. Ralph was quoted saying, "We hugged each other like we were slow dancing." In the morning, they ate their last bit of food, splitting a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. They continued to make their way down the mountain, still off trail at this point, and their ordeal somehow got even worse when the freezing rain that they had experienced the day before picked back up. Despite their efforts on day 2, the men still were not able to make it out of the woods, and so they had to spend yet another night out in the freezing cold. When they woke up, it was now Monday morning, and the men were getting incredibly desperate and frostbitten, by the way. At one point, they ended up ditching their trekking poles simply because, quote, "We couldn't grip them no more. Our hands hurt." Monday night, temperatures dropped to an astounding 20 below zero, and that doesn't even account for the wind chill, by the way. With the wind chill factor, the hikers had to grit through a night of minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was looking very unlikely that they would survive for much longer. They needed to find safety, and fast. The next day, the men had hiked themselves into the area around Ausable Lake. Though still a remote area, there were a few seasonal cabins here which were boarded up for the winter. Sean and Ralph found one of these cabins and managed to break into it, and this would prove to be their absolute salvation. Inside the cabin were essential survival resources, including firewood and a bright orange jacket, which the men laid out on Ausable Lake for it to be more easily seen from the sky. It was also initially reported that the two found alcohol in the cabin and just absolutely went to town with it. Ranger Bill Sussdorf was quoted saying, "They built a fire and found a bottle of booze and got to the point where they were feeling no pain." However, Sussdorf would later take back this statement. As it turns out, one of the doctors who treated the men did say that they experienced no pain, so that part was true, but it wasn't because they were drunk. It was rather because they were severely frostbitten. Kind of a funny mix-up. I don't know why the ranger thought this, but obviously it's also very scary. A search for the two men had been underway since the previous day, and a helicopter eventually spotted some of their tracks in the snow. Rangers also discovered their discarded trekking poles at one of the many lean-tos scattered throughout the Adirondack Park. The helicopter was able to follow the men's tracks, and eventually it spotted the bright orange jacket they had laid out in the lake. And then, just after 4 p.m., the helicopter spotted Sean and Ralph. The men were brought to the hospital, and thankfully they survived, although once again they both suffered severe frostbite. One of the doctors who treated them said, quote, "There was half an inch of ice in the shoes. It's a waiting game to see how much tissue they will lose. They won't be able to walk for a few weeks." That sounds really bad, but the truth is that the two men were extremely lucky to be alive, and if they hadn't found that cabin, then they likely would have died out there in the cold. In our next story, however, it wasn't extreme cold, but rather extreme heat that just about killed a hiker. In Texas, the summer of 2023 was an absolute scorcher. I actually visited the Austin area right in the middle of the summer, and it was hot. Definitely not the kind of weather that would be safe, let alone comfortable, to hike in. But that didn't dissuade a 59-year-old marketing executive named Jeff Hahn from going on a hike with his daughter in Big Bend Ranch State Park. The pair had set out in the morning in order to try and avoid the heat, but it quickly caught up with them. It was mid-June, and the weather data shows that the temperature that day was 107 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was the temperature in the shade, mind you. Jeff and his daughter lost the trail they were following, and soon after, they ran out of water. Their situation was rapidly deteriorating. Jeff began cramping up due to the heat and dehydration, and he was unable to move more than a few short strides before needing to take a break. It's at this point that Jeff and his daughter knew they had to take drastic steps and fast. They decided to split up, which is a move that often leads to disasters in the stories that I cover. But regardless of that, they had a plan. Remember, Jeff was all but immobilized at this point, and they had no cell service, and so they had no way to possibly call for rescue. And therefore, it makes sense that they decided that Jeff's daughter would hike ahead and try to summon for help. Jeff would stay put in the shade under a rocky outcropping and just wait for rescue. This was important because that way, when help was on the way, they would know exactly where to find Jeff. It seemed like a good plan if they were to stick to it. And while Jeff's daughter stuck to the plan, successfully reaching civilization and alerting the authorities, Jeff did not. As time went on, the area that he was sitting in slowly became directly exposed to the sun, and Jeff's legs were cramping so badly that he just couldn't take it anymore. He was quoted saying, "With the way that my legs felt and the cramping condition I had, I didn't really have a choice to sit still." It's also likely that his judgment was being clouded due to heat exhaustion, and so, for whatever reason, he made the fateful decision to continue into the desert away from the one spot where he was supposed to be. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong idea here. It's not like Jeff just wandered randomly off into the desert. He was trying to follow the route that his daughter had taken, figuring he would close the distance between himself and rescue. However, instead of finding rescue, Jeff noticed an old mining shack a few miles off in the distance. He knew that the shack would at least provide some protection from the sun, and so he slowly made his way to it. And when he finally got inside, what he found absolutely shocked him. At this point, he was extremely dehydrated, and so right at the moment when he needed it most, Jeff found 2 1-liter bottles full of water. It was nothing short of a miracle, and it almost certainly saved Jeff's life. And as insane as this was, it was only the first of 3 miracles that would take place during Jeff's ordeal. Around 7:30 p.m. that evening, Jeff's daughter and the superintendent for the state park raced out via ATV to the spot where Jeff was supposed to be waiting. I'm sure they were worried about the condition that they might find him in. Many hours had passed, but when they arrived, neither one of them expected that he would just be gone. What the hell had happened? Jeff's daughter didn't have the slightest clue. Jeff hunkered down in the mining shack until darkness, and when it finally cooled down enough, he went on the move once again. It was a particularly dark night, and that, coupled with Jeff's deteriorating physical strength, meant it would be slow going. At one point during the night, he tripped on a rock and fell so hard that he broke one of his wrists. It seemed like this might be the final straw. Maybe Jeff's luck had finally run out. But I'm happy to say that wasn't the case. In fact, it was actually the opposite. Jeff had accidentally stumbled into miracle number 2, because when he fell, he landed right next to a rock with a large pit in it. And inside the pit was a pool of stagnant rainwater. Jeff drank from the pool using his water bladder straw, and he just laid there on the desert floor for a while until he finally mustered up the strength to keep walking. But before he knew it, the sun was up again, and the brutal summer heat was cranking back up. Though Jeff had been lucky in stumbling across 2 water sources in the middle of the desert, it still wasn't enough. He needed more water and some food for that matter. At one point, he traversed into a small canyon and promptly discovered miracle number 3 of his ordeal. Inside the canyon, there was a small flowing stream, and inside the stream there were some tiny tadpoles. Now, drinking from the stream was a no-brainer, but chowing down on the tadpoles was probably a tougher decision to make. Ultimately, though, Jeff knew that he needed some sustenance if he was going to survive longer, and so he took off his hat, he dipped it into the stream, and he pulled up a few tadpoles, and he ate them. And just after he did that, yet another miracle. Jeff saw a plane and a helicopter off in the distance. He wasn't sure if he had been spotted at first, but then just a short time after he spotted the plane and the helicopter, he heard a voice. And it wasn't something he was making up in his head, by the way. It was a rescuer, and Jeff's near-death ordeal was finally coming to an end. He was brought back to the trailhead where he was finally reunited with his daughter. On day 2 of the search for Jeff, rescuers believed that at this point they were most likely on a body recovery mission, not a rescue. The temperatures were so brutal that day that some of the rescuers themselves even ran out of water, with one of them saying, quote, "It was the hottest I've ever been. My brain was baked." And it would turn out that Jeff's situation was even worse than he understood at the time. He wasn't just suffering from heat cramps, but rather rhabdomyolysis. I think I'm saying that right. Anyways, this is a thing that occurs when damaged muscle tissue releases its proteins and electrolytes into the blood. It can be fatal or permanently debilitating, which is even more proof that Jeff narrowly escaped death. Thankfully, though, my understanding is that he's pretty much made a full recovery, and I definitely wish him and his daughter well. He's truly lucky to be alive. I'm sure he understands this, and that's also the case with the hiker in our next story. However, unlike Jeff, this hiker hasn't really released many details, but judging from the area that he went missing, I think it's safe to assume that he too narrowly escaped death. In May of 2001, 58-year-old George Null went for a hike in Angeles National Forest in Southern California. Null was not a novice hiker, and his objective was to hike Waterton Mountain, a peak over 8,000 feet tall. He was only planning on being out for the day and planning on hiking around 6 miles. However, Null would never reach this objective, and he wouldn't return home under his own power. Instead, his day hike turned into a fight for survival that would last for over 4 days. At some point along his hike, Null would lose the trail and end up getting lost. And it would turn out that he was not the first hiker to do so in this area. Leading up to Null's disappearance, there had been at least 3 multi-day searches for other lost hikers, and the reason that this area was so dangerous was because of the Bobcat fire that happened the previous year. The Bobcat fire burned more than 115,000 acres and had all but destroyed the hiking trails in the area. Trail signs, markers, and anything else that helped hikers stay on course were all destroyed. And by the way, loss of direction isn't the only danger that a burn zone like this presents. Dry, dusty conditions can make it hard to find water, dead trees and loosened boulders are ready to fall all around you, and the lack of shade means the Southern California sun will be beating down all throughout the day. I hiked through many burn zones on the Pacific Crest Trail, and so I can tell you firsthand, they're not fun and they can be incredibly dangerous. When Null failed to return home from his hike, his girlfriend became concerned and she reported him missing. By that same evening, searchers were already out looking for him, but they had no luck. They continued searching, and before anyone knew it, all the trails in the region had been searched, and it was now becoming clear that Null was lost off the trail in the middle of the wilderness somewhere. Null went missing on a Saturday, and despite incredible search efforts, it was now Wednesday, and still no sign of him had been found. At this point, helicopters were being used, and one helicopter team decided to scope out Bear Creek, which is an area that is very rarely visited by hikers. By some miracle, 5 days into his ordeal, Null was still alive, and he just so happened to be located at Bear Creek. He was able to flag down the helicopter and catch a ride out of the wilderness back to safety. And what's perhaps even more miraculous than that is that he was relatively unharmed. He was dirty and he was extremely hungry, but other than that, he suffered no major injuries or illnesses. You can even see it on his face in this photo that one of the helicopter crew members took. Null looks pretty freaking good for someone who was just in a survival situation for the past 4+ days. Though Null's experience and determination certainly allowed him to prevail, he was also extremely lucky. Getting lost in a remote burn zone is extremely dangerous, and had that helicopter decided to fly a different route, he very likely would have died in the California wilderness. My understanding is that the Forest Service has since closed the area that he got lost in an effort to try to prevent more hikers from getting lost, and also to let the burned forest revitalize itself. I'm very thankful that he survived, and I wish him well. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll hit that subscribe button and help us get to our goal of 1 million subscribers. Almost 80% of my audience is not subscribed. If you guys would all subscribe, it would help so much, and I would really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much to everybody for watching.